I'm absolutely delighted to introduce Charlotte Woodworth from the Princess Trust charity Business in the Community.
As Angela said, I work at Business in the Community, so we're a Princess Trust charity. Many of the people in the room belong to companies that are members. Talking about kind of what we're going to focus on today, I had a very robust set of conversations with Angela about what would be new, what would be novel, what do the people in the room not already know, and your very welcome decision to kind of focus on retention specifically as a theme for today. So I'm going to cover a few things. I'm going to do a little bit of just bringing us back to the basics of why we need to be having this conversation. So just reminding you a bit about the kind of state of play when it comes to gender equity in the working world in the UK today. I'm going to talk a bit about some of the kind of big picture themes that we see at Business in the Community as areas that we know organisations make progress when they lean into. So some quite kind of general top line stuff, which I hope will be helpful and not a little bit too familiar for you. And then I'm going to pivot to talk specifically about retention, some of the opportunities, some of the enablers and some of the barriers, and what we see from the awards and the work that we do with lots of different organisations in the country. I hope that kind of hits the nail on the head. So if we kick off with a bit of a discussion around why we need to be having this conversation. So if you kind of take a step back from the specifics and the sectors that you work in and the kind of different organisations, and you just think if you were kind of landing in the UK and were asked to understand, what's the state of play? It's 2024. Do we really still need to be talking about women? I mean, look around the room. There's lots of you here. Is it really still an issue? Absolutely. Whilst there has been some really impressive progress in some particularly key areas, actually, big picture, the UK is stalling when it comes to driving gender equity in the workplace. There's lots of different lenses that you can apply to it, and a lot of different kind of organisations and sectors will have particular areas of focus. But I wanted to highlight what I think of as kind of the four big indicators. They're not exclusive, there's many more you can apply, but these are the things that I think of myself as kind of having a role around trying to change. First off, the ongoing situation when it comes to women earning less money in our pocket. Progress on the gender pay gap is stalling. It's not working as fast as it could. And I think it's also really important to think about it with an intersectional lens. So we know particular groups are at much greater risk of being kind of unpaid or paid unfairly. Women over 40, Black women and the like. When I try and bring this home, I always sort of say to people, think about all the men and women you know and just have a kind of mental snapshot of the 10 that you've spoken to in the last week. And just ask yourself, do the men typically earn more than the women? Typically, that tends to be the case. I always think it's helpful just to kind of bring it out from the facts to think about your own connections. Power, we're still underrepresented in senior positions. We've got to a stage in 2024 where just 10 companies in the FTSE 100 are run by women. There's no Black women, there's no women of colour running those companies. It's 2024, and 90 of the 100, most influential, highest gross turnover organisations in the country are still being run by men. That's something that needs to change. Job security. So when we think about how sort of secure and settled people feel in their organisation, how predictable their routine is, what kind of access they are getting to kind of training and development, so their kind of status internally, women are much more likely to be working in what we term insecure work. So the kind of work where you might have unpredictable hours, you might have less access to kind of training and development, you might feel like you're a little bit precarious when it comes to your status in the workplace. Women are really overrepresented in that space. And finally, a very serious ongoing issue that we have when it comes to harassment and discrimination. We know that women and others of marginalised genders are much more likely to report that they're experiencing some form of gender-based harassment, gender-based discrimination in the workplace. That remains an ongoing issue. Nobody's really cracked it. I work with organisations across different sectors, many of whom are taking different approaches. I'm going to talk in a little bit more detail about that later, but I wanted to kind of label that at the moment, for example, I think one of the most standout stats is that women under the age of 26 working in the UK today, 1 in 2 women under the age of 26 says they've experienced some form of gender-based harassment in the workplace. The figures are staggering when you actually think about it. So that's why we're here. That's why I'm getting up every day. And I'm hoping that today I can put some more kind of fire in your belly to change these figures so that if we were meeting in 10 years, we'd be looking at a much more rosy picture. So if we turn to the next slide, what are we going to do about it? So I think there's a kind of key thing that I wanted to land, looking at the kind of very illustrious set of people online and in the room, and the different kind of people that have come along today and thought, what are we going to learn? You have an immense amount of power in your roles and your organizations to drive change. The choices that employers make around everything from your policies, your processes, the culture that you try and embed can be formidable in the impact that it has. I see at Business in the Community very, very clearly a sense of those organizations that have lent into this challenge, that have really thought we're going to make it different in our organization, and the immense impact that that can have. So just to give an example, Angela was mentioning that we unveiled our kind of top 50 last week. One of the organizations that we had in the room was a law firm called Norton Rose Fulbright. And I was kind of inviting them to speak and tell us their story. And one of the things that they did is they looked at their pay gap in sort of 2018, 2019. It was, as is common in the legal sector, pretty immense. And they just had an enormous laser-like focus on it. And within 6 years of having a kind of dedicated exec focus on it, trialing lots of different efforts, lots of different attempts to amend it, they reduced it by 20%. So just a consistent, dedicated focus. A lot of the things that many of you in the room will know about in terms of pay transparency, reward processes, how do we make sure we're applying kind of an equity lens to when we're making those choices. A lot of different things came into play, but that leadership focus, that commitment at the top really drove change. So I guess that's one of the things I really wanted to land with you all is it's a bit of a kind of glass half empty sometimes when Andrew and I were talking, but actually it's also an immense moment where you can drive a much more sense of kind of positive progress. A little bit of an advert for BITC for those of you that don't know us. So many of you are members, but we very much connect different businesses, different organizations that are working in the D&I space to really help you kind of connect and sort of harness best practice with each other. And one of the things that we've alluded to is that we run our Times Top 50 Employers for Gender Equality. How many people in the room have heard of that? Put your hand up if you've heard of it. Okay, that's quite pleasing. So just to give you a little bit of a snapshot of that, because the rest of what I'm going to talk about kind of builds on that. So annual awards, anybody can enter. Average applicant submits around about 5,000 words of information about what they're doing to drive progress, both kind of addressing barriers and difficulties, but also trying to harness opportunities. So my team back at Business in the Community, between them, they read more than 1 million words of detail about what UK PLC is trying to do. It's immense. It's an enormous piece of work. And it gives us a real sense of kind of looking under the bonnet about what organizations are doing, where things are progressing, where there's problems, where things are still persistently proving to be barriers. So what I'm going to talk about now is the kind of culminated learning from running those awards for more than a decade. We've been doing it now, and things keep changing. There's AI, there's flexible working, it keeps shifting. But I'm going to share with you the kind of learnings that we've taken from that and hope that that will support you in your journey to address retention. So this is the kind of big picture takeaway of what we found working with law firms, public sector, supermarkets, retail, fast-moving luxury goods, the energy industry, you name it. When we've connected with all of those different organizations, what's emerged as actually really being effective in terms of driving change is these kind of 8 headline areas. And that's BITC's focus in terms of what we try and encourage organizations to do. So to talk about these in turn. So the first thing that comes through really, really clearly for us is organizations that have managed to mainstream gender equality, that they've managed to make gender equity something that's considered at the top table, that has executive oversight. 9 times out of 10, they're much more successful on all of their other efforts. So we heard from Alexandra and Linda earlier on. I have got your names correct, I believe. Yeah, we heard from Alexandra and Linda earlier on who were talking about being the women on the nuclear executive and kind of leadership positions and moving to a place where women has sort of responsibilities around P&L, not just kind of in the support functions, what have you. We find very clearly that when organizations, either in terms of representation or in terms of commitment from allies to this agenda, when they have that kind of laser focus at the top, everything else begins to work much, much better. That once you've kind of got that objective level approach, it really drives change. Second, consider all women. I think if we were having this conversation a few years ago, a lot of the sort of discussion around driving gender equity, gender equality progress at work, I think if you kind of imagined who you were talking about, it was probably a woman that looked quite a lot like me. It's probably a white woman, probably a straight woman. And in recent years, there's been a really welcome understanding that when we're talking about inclusion in its broadest sense, when we're talking about gender equity in a really truthfully kind of holistic fashion, we need to consider all women. So that means applying and understanding all the different identities that might be coming into play, whether that's ethnicity, whether that's age, whether that's different marginalized genders. It means thinking about the different life stages and phases. You know, I'm a mother of two. At the moment, I have a very little one. In the future, I'm going to have elder care responsibilities. Women aren't a cookie cutter shape with the same needs and the same kind of responsibilities at all times. So it really is important that organizations trying to drive change recognize that different groups of women, different genders in your organization are going to be going through different challenges and opportunities. Help everybody care. So I'm not going to steal too much of one of my fellow speakers' thunder here. So I know we've got the wonderful Elliot Ray is going to be talking later on, who's a bit of a LinkedIn celebrity. So I'm always very pleased to see him in person. And Elliot Ray is going to be talking about the importance of organizations in thinking about dads. I won't say too much about it, but certainly from business community's perspective, we know that that pay gap that I talked about, the kind of persistent 15 odd percent, which is probably larger in some of your organizations, when you look at really trying to unpick that, one of the kind of key substantive drivers of that is the tendency for women to do the bulk of care, the tendency for us to be the ones that are kind of curbing our hours, shrinking our kind of ambitions, looking to be the ones that do pick up, drop off, that we're on call. When it comes to looking after children, but also when it comes to looking after kind of older adults or others that we have responsibility for. So a key way that organizations can really try and unpick that barrier is leveling the playing field when it comes to care, is moving to a place where you're enabling men to also have access to care at home. When we first started talking about this a few years ago, Elliot was not yet a celebrity. The conversation around a lot of this was very much about women had this burden of care and how could they progress at work when they were holding so much at home. And I think there's been a really welcome shift in recent times to hearing much more from men who are saying, actually, I want to be a present parent. I want to be involved at home. The pandemic really opened that debate. There were a lot of men who kind of came back to work and said, actually, I've really enjoyed seeing a bit more of my children. I've really enjoyed being a bit more present. Actually, it's quite nice to do drop off and pick up. And from BITC's perspective, our kind of clear recommendation is that you think about whether your policies around caring, whether they inadvertently sort of undermine your efforts to champion gender equity. Are you still saying when somebody says, I've got a caring responsibility, the first thing I need to know is your gender? Because that decides how much support my organisation is going to give you. We'd love to be working in a world where actually we see equal parental leave, gender neutral policies that really champion and support men and others to kind of step forward. I can see lots of people nodding in the room, so I'm glad you're persuaded. Flexible working, this comes through very, very clearly as an area where organizations that embrace flexible working in kind of all of its different flavors, all of its different kind of ways of doing it. So that might be a degree of autonomy around your start and stop times. That might be compressed hours. That might be job share. There's a whole kind of rainbow array of kind of flexible working organizations that are open to that prioritize it, that lean into it, that really try and think creatively about it, tend to find that they have better retention, that more women apply, that they reduce their gender pay gap. Actually, flexible working is a little bit of a key. You know, the phrase that's kind of doing around at the moment is flexible working is the door to inclusion. And I know it can feel a bit kind of, everybody's talking about it every day, there's another story about it, but I think it's really important to kind of remember like how empowering and powerful for women flexible working can be. Being transparent about how you set pay. So we know that women, when they apply for jobs, whether it's internally, so kind of a promotion or a sideways move, or whether they're applying kind of externally, so they've come on your website and they've seen your recruitment advert, we know that women are less likely to negotiate about pay. We tend to be a little bit more reticent about saying, can we have a discussion? I'd like to understand kind of what room there is here. We know that women are less likely to kind of feel connected. So we're less likely to kind of look on LinkedIn. Do I know anybody at that organization? Can I drop them a message? Ask, how does the pay banding work? Whereas men are typically more comfortable doing that. The data really shows that. So if as an organization, you're a bit kind of tending towards competitive, open to negotiation, subject to discussion, you're kind of disarming women from being able to negotiate effectively in terms of really ensuring that they're being paid fairly. Actually, pay transparency, which I think is going to really rise up the agenda. You know, The EU is making kind of big moves on it, and many of you will be affected by that. Pay transparency can be really, really integral to driving a more gender equitable kind of working place, enabling women to understand how pay is set, who's making those decisions, what are the bandings, what are my peers being paid. It really helps level the playing field. And that's a particularly intersectional point as well. So it's not just about the women. That's really shown to benefit like different groups who are at risk of kind of marginalisation. So people of colour, for example, are also shown to be less likely to be prepared to kind of negotiate when it comes to pay. So really trying to demystify that is a really powerful tool that you have. Taking the bias out of recruitment, that speaks to quite similar themes, but really thinking through, and again, I think many of you in the room are probably across this, so I'm not going to talk about it in too much detail, but the things around thinking about whether you're using gendered language in your job adverts, thinking about how you're labeling your approach to flexible working. Does it say happy to talk flexible working? Great. Does it say happy to talk flexible working? Some examples of what we do. Even better. Have you got a link to somebody who works flexibly at your organization that people can see their profile, how they're doing it? Does your job say we're looking for a superpowered, committed, driven individual who's prepared to lean into this challenge? Fewer women are going to apply for that job. The data is very, very clear. The language you use in those spaces really says a very clear message to people that are looking at it. Should I go for it? Should I not? We heard from Linda talking about imposter syndrome. And, there's lots of debate around that, but the data is just immensely clear. Women are less likely to say, I think I can do 70% of that job, and they're looking for 100%, but I'm going to put my hat in anyway. Men are much more likely to say, I can do 40% of it, but I'm sure I can figure it out. Just give me the job, I'll try, and let's have a negotiation about pay. So really understanding your audience, who you're connecting with, and thinking about the language and the framing, the presentation of what you're doing can have a really powerful impact just in terms of the people that choose to put their hat in the ring, that choose to start that discussion with you. Knowing your data, so really understanding what's going on in your organization. I shared there's some kind of national big picture figures, but actually really getting under the hood of what you're doing at your organization, what's going on for the women working in your organization, what's happening when they're choosing to leave, what's happening when they're choosing to stay, why are fewer women putting their hat in the ring for the kind of senior partner opportunity, really interrogating that so you've got an understanding that you're not kind of working to some assumptions and some norms, can really help you develop an action plan that's really evidence-based, that really links to the specific challenges that you're having. Last but not least, finally, one of the things that we see as a bit of a golden thread through the organisations that are pulling away, the trailblazers, the ones that are doing well on this agenda, is they're organisations that have recognised the power of culture. So, you'll have heard the different phrases of kind of, culture eats strategy for breakfast. It's the enabler for your organisation. It's a bit of a kind of hackneyed phrase because it's true. You can have all of those wonderful policies. You can have a brilliant policy about kind of fertility treatment at your organization, or the way you're going to support people who, have a health condition, or the kind of the fine print around how you'll enable flexible working. If as a culture, your organization's kind of the way that you live and breathe it, the experience people have of their peers, of their line managers, the modeling they see from their senior leaders, if that doesn't underpin and drive forward what you're trying to do, then a lot of those best efforts are going to fall down at the first hurdle. So you really need to think about how you move things from kind of good intentions, the right policies, the right processes, to really helping them come to life. So to share an example, and I hope Elliot's not going to give this example later, but one of the things I thought was fascinating is we worked with a big household name high street bank who had adopted very, very positive progressive policies around parental leave, supporting a lot of the men in their organisation to take parental leave. But they weren't finding very many people took it up. They held a few focus groups, they talked to a few dads. We've got this great policy, we've unrolled it. It's on the HR hub. It's linked to in the bottom of the emails. Like, we're doing what we can to promote it, but nobody's really going for it. We worked with them to do a big piece of research around understanding what was going on. And we spoke to a kind of cohort of men who either were about to or were thinking at some point in the future they'd become new dads. And we said to them, okay, so your organisation offers 3 months paid paternity leave when you become a new dad. If that happens for you, what do you think you'll take? And so some said, I think I'll probably only take 2 weeks. And some said, I'd take the full whack. And some said, I'd do in the middle. And then we said to them, okay, the average for this organisation is that people take 6 weeks. Without fail, all of the kind of potential new dads said to us, oh, well, that's what I'd take. So the ones that were planning on taking sort of 3 months said, well, if the average is 6 weeks, I'll go for that. And the ones that were thinking I'll take 2 weeks, oh, well, no, maybe I would take 6 weeks then, if that's the typical thing that's done here. And so that kind of concept of kind of peer pressure and kind of awareness of what others are doing, people are nervous about accessing some of those policies. They're a bit wary about what's going to happen. There's a very kind of specialist phrase, it's called pluralistic ignorance around whether or not you understand what others are doing in your situation. If people don't see others accessing some of those policies, if they're a bit wary about what it might mean, then they're likely to kind of shrink back to the old ways. So there's a really big piece there, I think, around culture, awareness, empowerment, really encouraging your networks and your communities to connect with one another. Okay, so I've done a bit there about kind of the big picture, why we need to be having this conversation. I've talked a little bit specifically about the kind of themes that we see coming through as kind of consistently kind of powerful areas of focus for businesses that are managing to drive change. What I'm now going to do is dive in particularly around retention. So talking with Angela, talking about kind of the Women in Defence Charter and the areas that you've worked on. I know you've looked at lots of different topics in the past, and Angela was very keen that I particularly kind of highlight what do we find really shows up when it comes to organisations really thinking about retention. Before I kind of get into too much detail, just to say, at the moment, women are really hot property. All the different kind of business stakeholders that I talk to, different sectors, different industries, we're really worried about our women. They're thinking about leaving. We're seeing some senior women beginning to move forward. There's a lot of women saying, actually, I'm looking at what's available to me and I'm not sure this is the right balance. So I definitely feel like a focus on retention seems to be something that's kind of echoing across the kind of working world at the moment. I think particularly at senior levels, there's a kind of awareness and hesitation around what's going on there. So to tell you a little bit about what we know makes a difference when it comes to really trying to retain the excellent women and others of marginalised gender in your organisation. So first off, just really prioritizing this as an area of focus for your organization. So I talked through those kind of known tactics that you can pursue, the known sort of themes that you should think about. So addressing those barriers, harnessing those opportunities, having this listed as a kind of core business imperative. Don't have it just sit in the HR corner. Don't have it just sit with the D&I team. Do what you can to get this on the exec leadership team agenda. Do what you can to have this be part of the town hall conferences, have it be part of the general everyday conversation. Championing gender equity, it's not going to just happen by itself. You have to kind of really push it up that agenda. So really continuing to focus on it is really important. We talked a bit about data with the earlier slide around kind of interrogating data about your organisation. And one of the things I thought it might be useful for you to kind of hear me talk through is alongside the kind of snapshot data that many of you will have in terms of, you know, your all-staff surveys, your engagement levels, the kind of profile of who's leaving and who's joining. There's been a real rise in organisations really trying to get kind of qualitative insights, and not just the kind of data and the stats and the facts, but actually, you know, listening circles with your networks, one-to-one conversations with people who are leaving. Can you tell me, you're going, what was the push? Was it a pull? Was it a push? Actually really trying to get a little bit of kind of granular insight underneath those figures. For some of you in the room, I'm hoping this might be a bit old hat, but for many of you, I think it might be a little bit of a newer way of doing it. Certainly we're seeing a business community, a lot of organizations really prioritizing listening as part of understanding their data. So really listening in and really trying to connect with different people in their organization. What's going on for you? How's it working? What is working? What isn't? Just to give a really kind of tangible example of that. We do a lot of work around sexual harassment and kind of bullying. And often organizations will say, well, in our pulse survey, we say, do you feel secure? Do you feel happy? Have you experienced anything bad? Now what we're beginning to see is organizations actively really thinking quite carefully with their pulse surveys and saying, I want to ask if somebody would feel confident speaking up if they witnessed or experienced sexual harassment. I want to ask them to rate how confident they feel speaking up in their organization. That's actually quite a shift in terms of more general kind of, how is it working here? Do you feel respected and included? But actually asking people to imagine, if I saw something inappropriate or I experienced something inappropriate, would I give it a 6 out of 10 or a 4 out of 10 in terms of whether I put my hand up and ring my manager or whomever it might be? So really using those pulse surveys to get quite a deep level of insight into what's going on, particularly around issues that might be a challenge for your organisation. Psychological safety. So we've seen a big focus in recent times around thinking about how you really encourage your employees to feel that level of comfort around challenging non-inclusive behavior, how you really try and drill down into having a culture that says, I'm going to come over here and look over here, I'm enjoying my photos. So facilitating psychological safety. So another kind of tangible example, again, on the kind of sexual harassment theme, when we look at the kind of top 50 applicants and people share all this data, there's always quite a big difference between the organizations that say, we're proud to report we haven't had a single incident of harassment reported to us this year. And I think, oh, hold on, you employ 50,000 people in the UK. There must have been something going on. The data tells me there's something going on. And then we see at the other end of the spectrum, we see the organizations that say, we've really lent into this. We've held the town hall conference. We've included, questions about comfort in our pulse surveys. We've worked with our networks to understand what might be going on, where some of the risk areas are. We've thought that there's a kind of barrier that we've identified that people feel if they have to put their name in the ring and they have to talk directly to their line manager, that can be a challenge for them in terms of sort of labeling poor behavior that they've seen. So we've introduced an anonymous hotline. And in fact, some of the big headlines that you might have seen in recent years around some of the big wigs that have lost their jobs in different big household name organizations, often what's proved to act as a kind of catalyst there is organizations introducing anonymous hotlines where you can ring and report something that you've seen. So just as an example of kind of encouraging your employees to address non-inclusive behavior. And I've talked at length already about kind of applying an intersectional lens. So that was a kind of spotlight on some of the learnings, which I hope is helpful. I'm just going to follow through with just returning back to that point on flexibility that we mentioned, and then I'll be coming to you shortly to kind of take any questions that you might have. So when we talk about flexibility, I mentioned it's become a bit of a kind of, everybody talks about it. I feel like it needs rebranding. I feel like the term flexible working just has become a bit kind of, play it again, Sam, like we've heard it so many times. And I talked a bit about how one of the things that we at BITC try and do is label that flexible working isn't just X, that actually there's a kind of buffet of different kinds of flexibility that you can be offering. And I think that's really important when you think about this agenda. But when we were first kind of, when this issue first kind of really rose up to the top kind of post-pandemic, we worked with Ipsos Mori to do a big piece of research where we kind of polled 6,000 people across the UK, all different backgrounds, all different kind of job status, senior, junior, all different regions. And we asked them a lot of specific questions about flexibility and how important it was to them. And I wanted to highlight one of the kind of core findings. 3 in 10 women said to us, I've left or I've thought about leaving a job because of the lack of flexibility. So I think when you're having conversations in your organization about retention, flexibility is just a kind of golden tool that you've got. It's so powerful. We all probably know people who've said, well, I'm not loving my job, but it's just so flexible. It really helps me. So I guess I kind of want to help ensure that flexibility doesn't become that always talked about thing and remind us of how important it is to women when we're talking about retention. I also wanted to shine a bit of an intersectional lens there. So there's a kind of disjoint between white people and people of colour's perspectives on this. So a third of people from an ethnic minority background. So if you're thinking about your ethnicity pay gap, if you're thinking about diversity of representation more broadly in your organisation, flexibility is a race issue. It absolutely is a race issue. So we would really urge you when you're thinking about flexibility to apply that gender lens, but also apply that intersectional lens, recognise how important it is for different groups. I can see I've got my 10 minutes. Thank you. Okay. And then the second thing that's happened since we did this, so we did this polling a few years ago, and then we've continued to work on this. And then we did another piece of research last year. And we found that post-pandemic, and this is probably, I imagine, mirrored in lots of your organizations, flexibility, which had previously been ranked at, you can see I've got the specific stat there, previously ranked at like number 17 in terms of how important it is to me that an organization offers it. So there was pay, there was status, there was remuneration, there was culture, all of those sorts of things were coming in, and flexibility has just shot up and now is ranking second only to pay when it comes to things that employees are looking for, specifically what would make them stay at their current employer. So that was my kind of big sort of focus in on flexibility in the context of retention. And then finally, and we can make these available, I think I've probably covered all of this, But I wanted to this is hot off the press. So straight from last week, I had my colleagues kind of pulling out the nuggets to share with you a few specific things that kind of came through this year when it came to organizations showcasing what they're doing around retention. And these are some of the examples that came through. And I think one that I haven't mentioned that is worth really flagging there is that kind of results-only work environment. And my impression, because of the sector in the room, is that might be slightly easier for some of your organizations than some of the other businesses that I work with. But if you're able to really make sure that people's progress is quite meritocratic, that it's not about that old school, I'm probably older than some of the people in the room. You remember when people used to leave their jackets on the back of the chair. But if you've really helped move to a place where you're really just thinking about output, you're really thinking about kind of indicators rather than, does this person fit with the team, which we know can really hinder women.